All right, well now it is a few minutes past, so I think it's time for us to get on schedule so we can respect the time of our two great guests with us here tonight. Again, I am Matt Landers. I'm Public Policy and Government Relations Director here at GSBA and the staff lead for our policy roundtables, which are normally co-chaired by our board members, Brian Adamson and Susan Fuller. So thank you for all joining us this evening. And just as I said before, if you can keep your phones on mute during the conversation, we'll be able to hear our speakers better, but we will open it up to question time for all of you later on in the program. And so with that, I am very excited to welcome the two leaders of our legislative chambers who were so gracious to join us today. And calling in from Chelan County today is our Speaker-Designate Laurie Jinkins, the representative from the 27th District, representing Tacoma, Ruston, and Fife Heights. This July, she was elected by the House Democratic Caucus to serve as Speaker of the House. And when she's confirmed by the legislature in 2020, she'll be the very first woman and the first open lesbian to serve as Speaker in our state. And since being elected to the House in 2011, her legislative priorities have included improving the mental health care system, promoting affordable housing, addressing homelessness, protecting people from discrimination and harassment, and reforming Washington's regressive revenue structure. And in addition to representing her district, Representative Jinkins is Senior Advisor at the Tacoma Pierce County Health Department. So welcome, Laurie.
Thank you, Matt. Great to be here.
And our Senate Majority Leader, Andy Billig, represents the 3rd District in Spokane. He was elected to the House of Representatives in 2010 and then to the Senate in 2012, and then elected Majority Leader by the Democratic Caucus in 2018. He is an advocate for children, working families, and small businesses, and is particularly focused on early learning and K-12 education, as well as increasing transparency in government. Outside of the legislature, Senator Billig is also co-owner and former general manager of the Spokane Indians Baseball Club. So welcome, Senator.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And again, we're so excited that both of you could join us today. We know that our membership across Washington State is excited to hear about what you and your respective caucuses are planning for the 2020 session. And so as a reminder for those of our listeners calling in, the Washington legislature operates on a 2-year cycle. This means that in odd number years like 2019, the legislature meets for 105 days to craft the biennial budget. But then in even numbered years, like next year's 2020 session, they meet for just the short session of 60 days. 2019 had some of the highest numbers of bills proposed in any session in a long time, and we heard often that it was extremely busy on all sides. And with this short session fast approaching, I wanted to hear from both of you what the priorities of your two caucuses were, and if you think there's going to be just as much activity in Olympia in 2020 as there was in 2019.
Go ahead, Laurie, you want to go first?
Sure, Andy. Well, Matt, I would say that I think right now is just when caucus members are actually starting to work on kind of perfecting their legislation. Usually after Labor Day, people really get into stakeholder meetings and start working on those. So I actually I can't announce to you what all the priorities are going to be for the caucus this year. I'm in Lake Chelan right now because I've just spent the day on our rural health tour and just came from Grand Coulee and earlier this morning in Leavenworth. And so we've gotten, I think, some ideas today and tomorrow on issues around healthcare that people will be seeking. I know I met with the LGBTQ stakeholders community last week, and I think HIV, STD modernizing that statute that's been in place for 30 years and has been virtually unamended during that time will be a priority for the caucus. I also know that data privacy is something that folks are really working on, and we'll see how that works out with stakeholders. And we will, there are, of course, going to be issues around government transparency that we'll work on, and I think I'm still from there kind of waiting to hear from committee chairs about what they're working on.
Great, and very similar, our process of prioritization is just getting underway. We have a Senate Democratic Caucus in October, where we go for 2 days to work on issues as a caucus and to really work on our prioritization process. But I mean, there are some things that we know will be part of the mix. Certainly, we're always working on education. We still have work to do in special education in particular. I think early learning will be a focus as well. We've invested heavily in the K-12 system, in the higher ed system, and early learning is sort of the third stool of the education, third leg of the education stool, and it's really the one that where you get the best return on investment. So it may have been the one that we should have invested in first, but definitely something that will get attention this year. You know, I think one of the things that you'll see us focus on, I know something Laurie and the House Democratic Caucus is focused on as well, is trying to fix our upside down tax code. It's probably one of the biggest issues that we face as a generation of legislators is how do we make our tax code more fair? And it's we're the most unfair tax code of all 50 states. We're 50th out of 50. We joke that our slogan should be, we want to be 40th, and not normally something to strive for, but if we were 40th in tax fairness, we'd be way better than we are right now. And then the last thing I'll say is on transportation. I think we're all a little nervous because of the IMIN initiative, Initiative 976, which would just dramatically cut investments in transportation infrastructure, in transit and bike and pedestrian projects and road projects, maintenance. Would really be devastating, I think, for mobility, efficiency, and equal access to transportation. So really wait and see what happens with that initiative. But if it passes, that'll be a hot topic of how do we save our transportation system and see if there is a way to save it. And you know, I think you mentioned about the last 2 years have really been busy. We had 2 very productive sessions. We did a lot of big policy. We did big budgets. I think this session, both because it's 60 days, it's an election year, and because of everything we've done the last 2 years, I think it certainly will be a slower session.
That certainly makes a lot of sense there. And you've already hit on several of the questions I had queued up for you. One of them was around Initiative 976, which would bring the car tabs back to $30, but would gut some really important transportation funding in every county in the state there. Laurie, do you or does anyone in the House have any plans or ideas about 976 and the impacts that could have around our communities as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, so 976 will cut about 18% of the state's transportation budget. That's a huge cut, and it's mostly targeted to multimodal. So the things that we're looking at in terms of transporting larger populations of people and not using single vehicle cars are the things that this initiative targets. And I'm not aware, there might be numbers out about local government, but so that 18% cut that I just mentioned, that's not even including a local government car tab dollars, which we see a lot on the I-5 corridor, where a lot of counties have adopted those. So it would be even more expansive than that. I think a couple of things that we have to think about is, one, if that initiative passes, as most Tim Eyman initiatives, as has happened with most of his, there are lawsuits, and most of them are found to be unconstitutional. We'll see about this one, so there would certainly be litigation if it passed. I think we would hope, though, that it would not pass and that people would realize how important our transportation infrastructure is to our complete economy. It's part of the base of us having a great economy here in Washington State. So we want people to recognize that. But I think also, just to be responsible, we do need to prepare should that initiative pass and should litigation not stop it from being implemented. And that means kind of starting to plan early about what reductions we would look at, and trying to work collaboratively with the Senate and the governor's office so that we can go into a short 60-day session with a plan about how we're going to address it. I think is going to be very important.
Yeah, absolutely there. And we have 2 big important initiatives on our November ballot this year. 976 is one of them. The other is around Referendum 88, on Initiative 1000. It's a little bit tricky language there. GSBA was long a supporter of the efforts to overturn the previous I-200, which limited affirmative action in Washington State. We strongly supported Initiative 1000 late last year, the earlier part of this year, and now we are as well part of the Approve campaign for I-1000/referendum 88 there. Where do either the two of you or your caucuses stand on expanding these opportunities in public employment, public contracting, and in universities? And how can we work to further break down the barriers that I-200 put up 20 years ago? And how can we help get together a better Washington where everyone truly has the opportunity?
Well, thank you to GSBA for being a part of the campaign to approve I-1000. Our caucus voted, both Democratic caucuses were in strong support and voted to pass I-1000 on the last day of session. And it was a wild last day of session. I mean, we got so much done. We finished on time, which even for those of us on the inside, we weren't so sure even a few hours before. But not only did we get done on time, but we passed I-1000, which was a little bit up in the air for a good part of the session on whether the votes were there. But both Democratic caucuses passed it, which was great. Both chambers passed it with the support of the Democratic caucuses. So there was definitely support. And I think, you know, what you can do is to support the campaign, but you know, just getting out the factual information. One of the things, I was fairly new to this issue. It's just not I hadn't been on the committees that had dealt with this issue in the past. And so it was a learning experience for me. And the real take home, and I get distressed at some of the rhetoric that I've been hearing about this referendum, is that this has nothing to do with quotas. And even one of the statements to try to overturn this initiative mentions quotas. And the fact is that those are not allowed under federal case law. Quotas are not allowed. So this is just creating ways to make our society more fair, and I think just helping to get the information out there is a huge would be a huge help, and I appreciate that you're part of the campaign.
Yeah, I completely agree with Senator Billig about this, and he and I worked hard together on the last day to get this off the floor of the Senate and the floor of the House. And it's important, first of all, for people to remember it is Approve Referendum 88 if you want to keep Initiative 1000. Again, complicated kind of language. But I think the other thing that I would just add, I mean, I'm somebody who debated Tim Eyman 20 years ago up and down the I-5 corridor again on Initiative 200 when he led the effort to end equity in employment hires and contracting here in Washington State, and he was unfortunately successful in that. I think now we have a chance to bring that kind of equity back. It's important for, I think, people to really remember and understand that whether it relates to contracting, and we saw data on this, the incredible decrease in contracting in women and minority-owned businesses after the last 20 years, and that is part of why I-1000 is so important, is to bring back some equity in competition for those kinds of contracts and for employment and things like that. But you have to be otherwise qualified to get the contract or to be employed in a job, and then what has to happen is there would be a study showing that there is inequity, racial inequity or gender inequity, and if that's established, then you could get kind of a bump or help getting that contract. But you have to be qualified first in order to get it or to get a job. And so this is really about fundamental fairness. And I worry that people really won't understand what the referendum's about. So what's most important is that GSBA members, as Andy said, thank you so much for being supportive of this, but really get the message out in our community and make sure people understand how important this is.
Yeah, and thank you both for your support in Olympia for this. This is something that's going to be a hard rest of the campaign with just about a month left before the ballots drop, but we're going to get the word out there. And again, like Laurie said, it may be complicated with all the numbers, so all you have to remember is approve, approve, approve. So then,
Except for when it comes to 976, then that's no.
and that's
No.
a no. Yes, correct. And then Representative Jinkins, going back to some things you talked about in your opening statements there. It's been pretty exciting for many people in the LGBTQ community to see your designation as the next Speaker of the House, both for the important milestone it represents within the community, as well as a strong validation for the work that you yourself have spent your life doing to prevent all Washingtonians from discrimination, including, but certainly not limited to, the LGBTQ community. Kind of on the going off the discussion about I-1000, what are some areas where you would like to see Washington continue to advance its civil rights laws?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we did a great job last year by passing the LGBTQ Commission, and I think we have a new executive director who I'm very proud is from Tacoma, Manny Santiago, who ran the Rainbow Center in Tacoma. He'll be, I think, a great first executive director, and really will bring a sense of very broad equity to that job. And I think now the governor is in the process of appointing commission members, I-1000. But I think it was really a strong move forward. But I think there is so much more that we can do when it comes to equity, when we think about the education of our kids, and things like discipline that in the K-12 system, and the inequity in school discipline and how that has long-time effects on kids. Same thing, Senator Billig talked about early childhood education, and we know that children who are exposed to adverse childhood experiences have many things over the course of their life, then many kind of strikes against them that really make it much harder for them to be successful. We also have significant challenges with racial equity in our criminal justice system, and people just are fundamentally treated unfairly. One of the things that I've told a lot of people, Matt, is when I was thinking about running for Speaker, I thought a lot about the things that my family has gotten, the fact that I've been diabetic since I was a kid, and I've got health care because of the Washington State Legislature and in many ways the House Democrats. My wife survived cancer. We have a son that we were able to have through artificial insemination. He got a great K-12 education. He just left for college. My wife and I were able to be married. Those are all things that I want every family in the state to have. And we have to have Democrats in control of the House and the Senate if that's the kind of stuff we want every family in the state to have. So I think broadly that's some of the stuff that we need to be looking at.
Great. And Senator Billig, do you have anything you'd like to add to that as well on the Senate side?
Well, I mean, Laurie said it very well. Oh, sorry. I think, one of the things I saw this year as our caucus became more diverse in so many different ways, including by doubling our LGBTQ caucus in the Senate, we got better. I mean, we got better because we had more diverse views being represented. We had more people in the state being represented. I mean, we all represent a district of about 125,000 people, but we need to get a diversity of experiences and a diversity of views and diversity of talent in each of our chambers and each of our caucuses to really bring all of the talent and the energy and the creativity and innovation of Washington State together. And it just was so palpable this year in the Senate Democratic Caucus as we added a bunch of new members who brought all this diversity, and we saw it. We saw it with the incredible progressive agenda that we passed this year, and I think you'll keep seeing that carry forward. And our legislature is starting to look a little bit more like our state as a whole, and that's a really good thing for us as an institution, as a legislature, but also for the state as a whole.
Matt, I just wanted to add too that when I met with my caucus members before I was elected, one of the things that a broad a broad swath of them talk to me about is bringing a stronger equity lens to the work that we do, both to how the House operates, to our policies, to how we recruit candidates and how we support them. And I couldn't agree more with Senator Billig. Sometimes when you have that diversity around the table, and we know this in the LGBTQ community, it can sometimes be a little bit harder and take a longer time for everybody to understand each other's perspective and to get to a solution. But the solution is almost always much better than it would have been without a diversity at the table. So I think that's extraordinary, and the House had the same experience that the Senate did. We have the most diverse caucus we've ever had, and that's really exciting.
And you know, I thought it was after Representative Jinkins was elected Speaker-Designate, there was like this, there was an excitement in our caucus as well, because one, because we know Laurie, we like Laurie. In fact, she and I came in together as freshmen 9 years ago, but also because she represented the first woman speaker, the first lesbian speaker, and you know, just that we are changing. It's her personally and her talents, but also just this representation that we are changing for the better as a state.
Exactly.
And I feel no pressure whatsoever.
Exactly. And going off of what you said, Laurie, about having the more diverse input, it can take longer, but it almost always results in the better decisions. I think we've seen that with some of the things around the LGBTQ caucus. The governor's office has worked really closely with us on the creation of this commission, and did a lot of work reaching out to the community, and including held for the first time ever for any of their commission executive directors, a public second round interview for candidates for this commission. So we're very optimistic about it. The community's really number one ask was that the full diversity of the LGBTQ community across the state be better recognized there. And so from your perspectives in the legislature, while having a more diverse caucus around you certainly helps, it's still a small group of people representing, you know, the several million Washingtonians. Are there other aspects of government, for example, as the various minority commissions, are there ways that they can help provide information, those diversity of experiences? How can those perspectives be brought in other ways to the work you're doing?
Well,
Do you want to kick this one off, Andy?
sure.
Go ahead.
You know, I think all of the ways that citizens have input generally are ways that we can get input from the different commissions and from citizens at large. And that's, you know, by participating in the process, whether it's testifying on a bill, whether it's getting in contact with legislators. And just a few tips that I'll throw out there. Meeting with legislators during the interim is really effective. You get more time, you get more attention. Legislators generally, most legislators are very open. I know for our office, I never have turned down a meeting request from a constituent ever. And also email is so effective because, like in our office, I read every email. I get help responding to the emails, but I read every email that comes in. And we also do reach out specifically to the commissions, but I wanted to make it a little broader, but for individuals, members of those commissions, or really anybody, that the input is not just, sometimes people say, oh, I don't want to bother you. I don't want to bother you, but it's not bothering us. It's our jobs to hear from the public, and we can only do our jobs well if we get that input. So I would say interact with your legislators as much as possible. You're not hassling them. You're actually helping them do their job, and it's crucial for if we're going to represent the state appropriately.
I really agree. I also think that it goes the other way. Many of our diverse communities, and especially communities of color in the LGBTQ community, have frequently felt like aced out of being able to be engaged with government. So the commissions that we have out there, they represent these communities, whether it's the Asian American Affairs Committee or a commission, or the African American Affairs, or Latino Commission, or now the LGBTQ Commission, the Women's Commission. Those commissions can reach out to communities that they represent and hopefully get more community members to come in and give feedback, because it's a more trusted place than government might otherwise be for them. And so I think that really means that that commissions have an obligation also to be bringing that back to the legislature. I think there's also a lot of topics that our commissions could focus on, and I'm kind of a believer in commissions really engaging with communities, seeing what the priorities for the community are, and then to really engage heavily on those topic areas. For example, I'll just say, 1 year in, the Women's Commission has really been looking at board and CEO leadership in corporations. And they're going to bring probably some legislative ideas to us, but really kind of honing in on female membership on those boards and in CEO jobs will really help the legislature be able to look at that, and they'll be a trusted source of information for us. So those are kind of a couple specific ideas.
If I can add just one other thing that may be sort of informational and something I've been thinking about, we thought about as we're answering this question, is the Speaker-Designate Jinkins and we get to appoint a lot of people to different commissions and services. And one of the things I've been thinking about as I make those appointments, or in the Senate we get to approve a lot of the appointments made by the governor, is to make sure that there's diversity on our boards and commissions as well, not just corporate boards and commissions. And the state as a whole has done a pretty good job of that, but not always. And also to make sure there's geographic diversity. It's a role that before I became a leader, I didn't really even know about or think about. And it's been really gratifying to be able to go out and reach out, say, to the commissions and say, hey, we have this opening on this charter school commission or whatever commission it may be that we're working on at the moment. Do you have any ideas? Because it's not equally represented. Can you give us some ideas? And so it's a way that we can interact with the commissions as well.
Yeah, I think that absolutely is a super important value to that. And just like you said, the geographic diversity, I think, was a huge focus as we were trying to encourage people to apply to the LGBTQ Commission, because we know that many LGBTQ people in rural areas and exurban areas and suburban areas, or even really just outside of Seattle and Tacoma, are often not popularly represented in how our communities discuss. So certainly agree with you on that. And then, so while our state has kind of a similar question, but while our state has one of the fastest growing economies, we know that these economic benefits are not hitting every part of Washington equally. We know that a lot of it is concentrated specifically in the Seattle region, but that there are other places. You both represent urban districts that are in Seattle, but there are many districts in suburban and rural areas that are just not feeling the same economic boom as parts of our state when the headlines are kind of glowing there. What are the ways that the legislature can ensure that our economy is working for all Washingtonians across the state?
You want to start us off, Laurie?
No, go ahead, Andy.
Well, I think, to me, when I think about economic prosperity, there's a bunch of pieces that the state particularly is involved in. And one is education. And we know that a sound educational system, whether it's early learning, K-12, and especially higher ed, are so important for a successful economy, but also for individuals to be successful in that economy. So I'm really proud of the work that we did with the House and the Senate together on a higher education bill this last year that really helped focus on sort of across the board higher educational programs, but particularly in taking the state need grant and expanding it to everybody who's on the waiting list. We have this great state need grant program to help low-income children go to college, but we had a huge waiting list. And so we came up with a plan. It was sponsored by Representative Drew Hansen, then Senator Palumbo worked closely on it as well. And basically said, we're not going to have a waiting list anymore. And so that's going to get phased out. So I think that's one of the big ways. I think the other thing is to look at infrastructure. And we've got both our transportation budget and our capital budget, which is sort of building the foundation of a successful economy, and really important because those budgets are creating short-term jobs through all the construction, but also creating this foundation of infrastructure for a successful economy later on, and making sure that those budgets are touching every part of the state, and those projects touching every part of the state is something that we're focused on as well.
Yeah, and just I would just add on in terms of the transportation budget. It's construction, but it's also the result of the roads construction, and again, our multimodal system is one of the fundamental building blocks that we can do to build our economy in this state. I just want to give an example. The last big transportation package, the #1 road construction project in that was finishing Highway 167, which is a highway that comes across from eastern Washington, from our agricultural communities, and for 40 years it ended in Puyallup, and it never got to the port of Tacoma, even though that had been the plan for 40 years. And it was what was interesting is the reason it became the #1 road project was it wasn't just Tacomans or people in Pierce County who wanted that road completed. It was growers and legislators in eastern Washington who wanted their products to be able to get here, to be able to be shipped from a deep water port in Tacoma, and that's how it became the #1 roads project at that point. So I think we do recognize that things that are built in just one community have large effects, can have large effects in other parts of the state. And I'll be interested, Matt, when you open it up for questions, to hear actually suggestions that other people have on the line for economic development things that we can do to help everywhere in the state. I would say, living in Tacoma, for me, one of the things that I worry about is the increased prices in our housing market. The Tacoma housing market has been regularly rated in the last few months as one of the hottest in the country. But if essentially we're becoming a bedroom community for folks who are priced out in Seattle, that actually doesn't help economic development in the Tacoma area. So we really have to think about those kinds of things too.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are something I think it's all the minds of our members all the time there. And so Senator Billig, you talked a bunch about the education. Last year, your Fix Our Tax Code plan included a working families tax credit, B&O tax relief for small businesses, property tax reductions for seniors, and that would all be kind of countered by, I think it was $780 million in a capital gains tax, which has been floated around for a number of years, has a lot of proponents as a way to rebalance that very unbalanced tax code, as you mentioned at the beginning of the call there. Do you think the legislature is going to look again at a capital gains tax? And if so, what could it look like?
Well, I think a capital gains tax will keep coming back because it is a more fair tax. So when we look at either when we need more revenue, if we need more revenue, or if we want to find a way to get a fair tax to in exchange for decreasing some unfair taxes and help to right-size our tax code, I think that you will keep hearing about capital gains. So I think you will see some proposals. I think you'll see something similar from the Senate Democratic Caucus, where it's really focused on tax fairness. And there's a variety of ways to do that. One of the things with a capital gains tax, I think, is that you can structure it a lot of different ways, but almost every way that has been proposed would hit a tiny percentage of people, and would hit them at a time when they're having a very profitable event in their life, to take a portion of that to dedicate it to something really important. And that could be some investment for the state as a whole, or it could be a way to fix this very upside down tax code and really help. We know that that's holding us back. And we talk about having an economy that works for everyone. Probably the most fundamental thing we can do to help in that goal is to help the tax code to be more fair. Yeah,
Matt. Well, so I've only prime sponsored the bill for 7 years, so I I'm only moderately interested in the
Only
topic.
a little bit. Yeah.
But I mean, to me, one of the things I'm really excited about in addition to cap gains tax is just that we have a tax structure work group that has been pulled together under a lot of the leadership of Noel Frame. But it's a bipartisan, bicameral group that is really looking at our tax structure broadly and what makes it more fair. I've always loved capital gains in a lot of ways because it represents bringing fairness. Now, if that tax structure work group takes a look and says, hey, there's something that's more fair, or, you know, the way it's designed isn't quite right, there's a way that you could design it that would bring more fairness to our tax structure, I'm really all about thinking about that. But I think there are other kind of topic areas you know, related to our tax exemptions and things like that they'll probably be looking at. When Andy talks about tax unfairness in Washington, I just want to be real with people about what that is. The poorest 20% of Washingtonians in this state spend almost 18 cents of every dollar they earn on taxes. The wealthiest 5% spend about 2.3 cents of every dollar they earn on taxes. And that is in large part due to the fact that we are so heavily reliant on a sales tax. So when you think about a sales tax, for example, there's just only so many pillows that somebody needs to own, no matter how wealthy they are. So, you know, the tax that a poor person pays on a pillow is a higher percentage of their income than it is for a wealthy person. And a wealthy person doesn't need 1 million more pillows than a poor person does. You know, and you can think about that in a lot of different ways. And that's why we see this huge disparity in tax structure. But if we could do things where wealthy folks are paying their fair share, that would help us invest in more services broadly for Washingtonians. Or if we could do something where the poor segment of our population is having to pay fewer taxes, then they would have more money available to them to reinvest in the economy. So there's a number of different ways to do this. I'm interested in all of the ways and thinking through a number of good things that we could do.
Thank you, Laura. I think that explanation is really spot on and so important for us to remember. GSBA has been working with Representative Frame and the tax work group specifically around small businesses because they face that same kind of disparity there. And we've really appreciated the work that Representative Frame has done and the other members of the committee to make sure that small businesses are part of that solution as well, because I think it's excited to see what they come up with and see what goes forward there. But now I am going to turn it over to everybody else in the conversation here. I'm going to unmute your volumes and give you all the permission to have your videos if you so choose. But then we will open it up to questions for our speaker designate and our majority leader. So opening the floor to everyone else. I'm just going through and activating everyone's videos here.
Andy and I are working on a song and dance routine, but we're just not quite ready yet. So.
All right, so people are unmuted. I know we've got, let's see. Oh, Susan Fuller is one of our co-chairs of the Public Policy Council. We're glad that she could join us tonight. Susan, do you have any questions you would like to ask?
Not really. I was kind of interested in the income tax, or I should say tax thing. It perhaps was a Freudian slip there. So thank you for talking about capital gains. But I guess thinking ahead, do you guys see any room in the future for opening up a conversation about income tax?
Well, I mean, I guess, Susan, I think that the tax structure work group may talk about that. I don't think I think there's a lot of, honestly, a lot of falderall where people say, the legislature's talking about an income tax. Democrats are going to pass an income tax. Honestly, there actually hasn't been that much conversation about income tax, except for, I would say there's a context here about it for a business context, which I think is interesting. One of the things we hear a lot is that our B&O tax structure is super unfair because it taxes folks on their their gross income, not their net income. So especially when you look at small or startup businesses, I'll have a lot of business owners who say to me, it'd be fine if you wanted to tax me on my net income, but to tax on my gross when I'm a startup, that is killing me. Well, you know what taxing on the net would be called here in Washington under our Constitution? It would be called an income tax. So that's the reason that we tax on gross income. And so, you know, again, I don't have a prediction over how these conversations are going to go, but there is a recognition that there are challenges when we go on gross income. And likewise, that's probably an explanation for why we have, you know, 650 different tax exemptions, is that's how Washington State has tried to deal with this issue. Are there other ways to deal with it? That's what I'm hoping the tax structure work group looks at. But, you know, we also then have to look at what it is that our voters and constituents want and what they're worried about. And, you know, I think income tax has always been something that people have worried about. So I can't say that it's going to be something that we're going to do anytime soon or ever maybe, but it certainly is different. It certainly is worthwhile to look at all options and then see where we go.
Yeah, I cannot see us doing an income tax. I don't think that there's the support to do it. I think it would have to be a complete overhaul of our tax system, which would actually be a good thing.
Right.
But even in sort of a theoretical standpoint, even the Republicans admit that an income tax would be better as part of a overall system change. And I was talking with one of the Republican House leads on revenue a few years ago, and he said that. He said, "Well, of course, an income tax would be better." But you know, I don't think anybody's going to agree to just add an income tax. So it would be changing the B&O tax and lowering the sales tax and doing something. And it's, you know, it's interesting representing Spokane. There's a lot of comparisons to Idaho, that most of which, you know, I don't want to take anything from Idaho, but they have a really good tax code. And because the ideal tax code is where you tax a lot of things broadly, but not deeply. So have low rates on a number of different taxes, don't give a lot of exemptions. That's not only fair, but it also helps you weather economic ups and downs because you've got a broader base. And that's essentially what Idaho has. And if Washington had Idaho's tax code, we would have $7 billion more, and it would be more fair.
Yeah, that statistic just kind of wows me every time. Don't usually look to our Eastern neighbors for that kind of role modeling, but they've got something figured out there for sure. Are there other things we've got in Washington, or is there other ways that the legislature could better support small businesses across Washington State in the upcoming session? Laura, you're mentioning that you even knew what the difference between the B&O tax on gross and net was. I think shows that you know a lot more than some other elected officials we talk to sometimes. That's one of the biggest frustrations we hear from our members, is that they try to talk to policymakers and they don't even know that difference. So that is great to hear that you see that, you understand that. We know the other issues are much larger than that, trying to get back to the income tax and the constitutional rules there. But back to the actual question was, what else can the legislature do around small businesses in Washington?
Well, I would just say this is one of the strengths of GSBA, Matt, is that there are so many small businesses. I mean, GSBA is comprised, my guess is a very high percentage of GSBA members are small business owners. And I think legislators generally are interested in having people in their community come to them and identify problems, and then working with them to try and provide solutions. I'll just give you an example. A couple of years ago, I had somebody who brought, I'm not a big tax exemption person because we have so many of them, but one of the challenges has been for mid-sized companies who want to provide their workforce with some education that they're just not able to do financially and because of the size of their workforce. You know, I proposed an exemption for smaller and mid-sized businesses to encourage them to be able to let their workers join and get, you know, some sort of higher education. Now, the exemption didn't end up passing, but it was a really great conversation with the community on what it would be that would help, because a lot of these were companies that were having challenges with workforce shortage. Right, and I work in healthcare a lot. That's also an area where we have workforce shortage. So I wouldn't say I have a huge number of ideas right now. And one of the things when I ran for this position was I said that we have 57 members in the House Democratic Caucus who have a lot of brilliant ideas about things to do. I want to rely on them to bring the brilliant ideas to the caucus. My job is to figure out, I have a lot of food analogies. My job is to figure out, is this a meal we want to eat? If it's a meal we want to eat, how big of a bite can we take and chew in a particular year? And then secondly, how many bites do we need to take in order to chew the whole meal? But I'd really encourage your members to bring ideas to their legislators or to Senator Billig or Rye or anyone they know. And I think we'd be interested to hear about them.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of that. And, you know, there are a couple things specifically that we've done and that we can continue to do for small business. One is we can continue to look at improving the B&O tax. The other thing that I think the state is in a good position to do is to help coordinate amongst different municipalities. So one thing is that some businesses that operate in multiple municipalities came to us and said, hey, you know, fine, we're okay paying this and we're paying that and the different business, but, you know, give us one portal to go to. Give us one scheme, try to harmonize it as much as possible. You know, we want to still have some local controls. We're not saying, you know, the state's not going to come down and say it has to be this one particular way, but the business license is a good example. If we're going to get a business license and register for a UBI number at the state, let us get our local business license at that same time with one transaction. And so we've been able to do things like that, and there's more work that we can do. And then, you know, as a small business owner myself, one of the things that I know and that lots of people, you know, continue to tell me who are small business and just business people generally is, look, change is going to happen, but try to make it predictable. Try not to change it a lot, and also try to make it, so it's one of the things I've really worked on, say like with as we make changes, whether it be minimum wage, of course that wasn't the legislature, that was a citizens initiative, but or other changes, to try to make sure that the changes that happen are gradual so small businesses can adapt, or that we give a longer timeline to small businesses to be able to adapt to some new policy that we're working on. And we've been able to do that as well. And the last thing I'll say is that I think as we continue to work on healthcare in Washington State, to make sure that everybody has access to affordable, quality healthcare, that's something that helps businesses. It's a huge expense for our business. And if we could get to the extent that we can get better access as a business, or our employees, even individuals, some kind of universal care or through some other system, that helps us as a business, because it gives us certainty, and we don't have to hold our breath every year when we hear what our healthcare rates are going to be.
Exactly. And so are there any, we've got time for about one more question tonight. Does anyone anyone else on the phone want to contribute as well?
Hi, Matt. This is Mona. Can you hear me?
Go ahead, Mona.
I was wondering what Laurie and Andy, what your thoughts might be on criminal justice reform. You know, there's a lot of talk about how it's failing, and particularly failing communities of color. And I would ask you to also include what thoughts you might have on criminal justice reform and tying with it excellence in education, and really leaving no child left behind.
Go ahead, Laurie. That's right.
Yeah. I mean, I'm happy to start, Mona. I think one of the big things that we have going on that we'll probably spend time the next couple of years doing is the Sentencing Review Board has done an extensive review of our sentencing guidelines. They haven't been updated in some time, and the final report hasn't come out yet. But I expect that we'll see a legislative task force develop to really start working on the recommendations from the Sentencing Guidelines Commission. There are some things, I mean, I have a bill that kind of kicked this off a number of years ago, where we have particularly young people, mostly young men, and a huge percentage of them men of color, who were convicted at a very young age, 19, 20, very long sentences, whose family members approached me and wanted some ability for the young person to show that they had changed, that actually the criminal justice system had done what we all had hoped it would do, which was to rehabilitate and to give them a chance to come out into the community. That bill didn't end up passing, but eventually that's the bill that led to the Sentencing Review Guidelines Commission doing a review. So I think that's one thing that we'll see. I would just say that we did a really great revision to the 3 strikes and you're out law this year. I think it's the first one that's been done. And we removed, I think it was burglary 3 as one of the strikes, because the 3 strikes and you're outlaw is supposed to apply to crimes where there is harm to a person. In Burg 3, by definition, there is no harm to a person. So we removed that so that folks in the future can't be subject to 3 strikes and you're out. Unfortunately, there are about, I think, 60, almost 70 some people who are in jail as a result of a burglary 3 conviction that are still going to remain there, although I think the Clemency Board is looking at clemency for some of those. So that's a second thing that we have done. And then just the final thing is I really feel strongly that my caucus telling me they want to place an equity lens when we look at policies is going to be a major shift in how we look at criminal justice issues. And let me just give you an example. This isn't exactly criminal justice, but a number of years ago when we did the distracted driving bill, where folks could be fined for talking on a cell phone while they were driving, and then eventually it became a primary offense where you could actually be pulled over and fined. Probably a good idea to do that on a lot of levels, but one of the things I don't remember us ever discussing was that people of color disproportionately already being pulled over for things and whether or not this would increase. And we didn't, if we had done that, we may have still passed the bill, but we might have required some data collection so we could look at what was happening. We might have had other fixes or limitations that we placed in the bill. So that's the kind of thing I think by adding an equity lens and being really firm about that, we'll have better outcomes as we look at criminal justice bills.
Yeah, and Laurie's been such a leader on criminal justice issues, and her seatmate, Senator Darneal, is there for the Senate Democratic Caucus, and we had a really good session when it comes to criminal justice, particularly related to juvenile justice this year, and really proud of what we had, the 3 strikes bill, but also the valid court order bill, Senate Bill 5290. And several others. I wanted to touch on, you mentioned also excellence in education, and a bill, it may have gotten mentioned earlier, but Senator Leas had the transgender bullying bill this year, which I think is really important, because if we talk about school working for everyone, we've got to make sure it's safe for everyone. And that was a really important piece of legislation. And then also looking at discipline and making sure that suspension is either not used or is used as a last resort, not a first resort. And if there is a suspension, that it is done only for the purpose of giving time for the community, the students' community, parents or teachers, counselors, doctors coming together to make sure that they've got a plan to reenter safely and to succeed. And too often, it's just been something, suspension's been the easy route. And we've got to make sure that that is not the way our schools are proceeding, but making sure they're focused on the success of every child. Discipline in schools is absolutely disproportionate based on race, and has been a focus for the legislature and for OSPI, and needs to continue.
Perfect. Well, thank you both. We are coming right up to the end of the hour, so I would like to thank you both for calling in from Spokane and Chelan and joining all of us from GSBA who were able to call in. We're really thankful for your time. Thank you for the work that you both do in serving our state and leading your caucuses.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for hosting.
Yeah, that's great.
All right. Have a great evening.
You too.
Take care.